Hi, my name is Max Easton, and thank you to WestWords for inviting me to read a chapter from my first book called The Magpie Wing, out now from Giramondo Publishing. This chapter is called Comrade Coleman. Walt was the first to find his grandfather. His body was pale and rigid at the foot of his brown and yellow armchair. His arm was reaching out to a midi glass, the beer once inside it long since soaked into the carpet. There was a pained expression on his granddad's face. Walt imagined that it stemmed from the anguish of spilling his drink, rather than the heart attack the coroner later claimed had occurred a few days before Walt found him. It was a strange lesson for him to learn as a teenager, that in the face of a death in the family, he'd feel nothing at all. When Walt and Sam arrived at the house for their weekly visit, the screen door was flapping open and shut in the summer breeze, its thin aluminium frame banging hard enough to have been heard and ignored by the neighbours. When Sam walked into the room behind his son, he responded with an annoyed sneer as he inspected the scene. He collected the midi glass and placed it on his dad's favourite piece of furniture, a glass-topped standing ashtray that stood next to the armchair with cigarette butts overflowing. "Should I call Triple O?" Walt asked. "Hold on, I'm thinking," Sam said impatiently. "If we ring an ambulance, there'll be a call-out fee." So we can't afford a call-out fee," he hissed. Sam left the room and returned with sheets he'd pulled hastily from his father's beds. He sighed and laid a sheet out on the ground, looking down at the body and gripping the old man by the shoulders while Walt stood dumbfounded. "Give me a hand and remember to lift with your back," Sam grunted humorlessly, moving to drag the body between the sheets to create a swaddle. "Dad," Walt interrupted, watching his father grapple with the body. "We should probably call someone." "Fuck," Sam replied, letting go of the sheets and telling his son to follow him to their high ace. Walt didn't know what exactly was happening as Sam walked into the van with his grandfather Fred lying dead behind him in the home. Sam was moving with such unperturbed confidence that it could well have been how everyone treated a dead body. They took off in the car, and Sam immediately began complaining over the sound of the radio about what he imagined was going to come next. He complained about the phone calls he was going to field for weeks once the obituary made its way to the local paper, running off a list of names with exasperated wax to the dashboard. But Walt hadn't heard of any of them. "And I suppose they're going to want a fucking funeral too," Sam yelled minutes later, slapping the van's indicator lever and wrestling the column shift down a gear. "A pissant get-together for all of Dad's cronies," he ranted, before pulling into the driveway of Liverpool Cemetery. Walt was surprised to hear that his granddad had friends at all, let alone cronies. He knew very little about Fred, who he'd only ever experienced as an old man with the hobbies of drinking, chain-smoking, watching Channel 9 at all hours, and occasionally having midweek pensioner meals at Club Liverpool. When they arrived at the Liverpool Cemetery, there was a communication breakdown between Sam, who asked for the next available burial plot for his father, and the 18-year-old receptionist who'd never dealt with such a request. The receptionist called for his manager, who also had no idea how to deal with the situation, not least because her primary responsibility was to provide the living with comfort in their time of mourning, and it was unclear how to help Sam in this moment, since he didn't seem to be suffering from any grief. When Sam told them that the body of his dad was at home and that he'd prefer to cut out the middleman by bringing the body to the grave himself, he was told nervously that he'd need a police report, a coroner's report, and a death certificate before he could proceed. "I'm sorry," the manager explained, "but you can't just bring a dead body to a cemetery." "How the fuck does that make any sense?" Sam said. The cemetery staff fell silent as he stared at them impatiently. "Why does it have to be so hard to put your old man in the ground?" Sam didn't get an answer. He took a deep breath, then left the reception hall through the automatic glass doors. He drove back to Fred's house, where they put the bed sheets through the old Whirlpool washing machine to cover up what they'd almost tried to do, and then Sam called Triple O. When the police arrived, the matter was sorted out promptly. They knew Sam well enough from their walkthroughs to the Railway Hotel, the early opener by Liverpool Station. Any minor concern about the cause of death lasted only as long as the coroner took to determine the heart attack. The ensuing arrangements were arduous. Sam guessed correctly that he'd be inundated by calls from Fred's old work colleagues. He was pressured to arrange a ceremony and did so half-heartedly, booking a function room at Liverpool RSL to follow the private cremation. Walt called his sister Helen in Wollongong to tell her the story, but she was unimpressed by their dad's behaviour. She waited patiently for Walt to stop talking so she could decline the funeral invite. She hadn't spoken to her dad since he kicked her out of home. Walt was curious about the mourners who gathered in the crystal room of Club Liverpool. There were handfuls of elderly single men, immaculately barbered with poorly tailored pants and short-sleeved business shirts. Some had smudged-out tattoos on their forearms. The range of postures among the aged attendants separated the active from the weary. Of the couples, the women were overdressed compared to their partners, and the room was filled with a specific brand of perfume that Walt had only ever detected in RSLs and leagues clubs. They congregated and moved in concert, shaking hands as though they had rehearsed prior to arrival, but Walt soon realized that they actually were rehearsed. They were of an age where their schedules must have been littered with the paying of respects to dead old acquaintances. Their actions felt forced, like a performance, and the whole scene bothered him. When Sam booked Club Liverpool for the ceremony, he'd requested an MC be provided, who ended up being one of the waitresses who knew Fred from his lunches there. She was kind but void of charisma, and began with a small spiel about Fred's favourite lunch order, roast of the day, every day, before inviting others to speak. Sam sat stone-faced at the edge of the room as the well-wishers got out one by one. He muttered to himself while they spoke, as though he'd anticipated every word, while Walt, on the other hand, leant forward in his seat to make sense of the information that filtered through the function room's cheap PA. "I met Comrade Fred on the job and we're both 16, one man began, his transition lenses a light purple as they slowly adjusted to the indoor venue. "We were both billed as labourers who'd barely worked a day in our lives. We became union men on the same day we started. We were only kids when we started getting involved in all the stockworks around town through the BLF, so we had to learn how to be disruptive. We learned at what point before a concrete pole you upturned your wheelbarrow and declared a strike. We learned when and how to form a picket line. And people talk about the green bands, they talk about the old buildings and neighbourhoods or the patches of bushland that were saved. These days they talk about one or two people who were the figureheads of this movement for heritage and land, as though they were movie stars. But there were hundreds of us who stood up to developers." The man paused for breath and looked up from his handwritten notes to engage the crowd. "The important thing about Fred, and we should never forget this, is that while the leadership was talking to the newspapers, Fred would be talking to the new members, telling them what's what, passing on the lessons that he and I learned when we joined the union. The movement will always rely on people like Fred, who talk about the issues to people who need to hear them. He didn't ask for much in return. Now that he's passed, I hope he can be forgiven for his missteps." A few impolite coughs filled his room in response, which Walt followed in curiosity. These sentiments filled most of the speeches that ensued. There were vague notions about a union, and Fred's role in spreading the word of the Builders' Labourers Federation, all ending with notions of atonement, of having erred on his path. An unspoken event had occurred, and Walt waited to see if anyone would be specific enough to speak ill of his grandfather at his funeral. "Comrade Fred was resilient," another man in an unseasonable blue cardigan said. "I watched him get run up against the wall and punched in the back of the head by a developer stooge once, and he showed up to demand to stop work the next day. He was tough, he was uncompromising, until the wheels fell off. We shouldn't forget that he was getting death threats every night, nor should we forget the violence he endured through his work with the party. Linda, his wife, who I met on occasion, left him for all of that. No one could say that Fred didn't have to make sacrifices. He made more of them than I did. The man was replaced by his partner, who wore an immaculate floral skirt and button-up shirt, tacked with a pin from the green band era. Now I heard all the stories about Fred," she began, "but he was always good to me. Fred could be difficult, but he always battled the developers, and he battled them anywhere. He didn't limit the fight to the rocks or Woolloomooloo. I don't think we ever would have had a green band in Mount Druitt if it weren't for Fred. He cared about the West in a way that those who fronted the Union didn't. And when the Union lost its way, when the party lost its way, he battled the executive as hard as he battled those responsible. That's all I have to say about him, really. And I hope Comrade Fred finds peace." When the MC asked for the family to give a speech, Walt tried to think of some words to honour his granddad. He considered telling a story about how he thought it important that his grandfather stopped watching rugby league when the Magpies merged with the Balmain Tigers to form the amalgamated Wests Tigers brand. He wanted to quote Fred, who used to call the merger a bastard child, and once went on an impassioned speech about how the rowing clubs of Balmain have nothing in common with the bowling clubs of Campbelltown. He thought there might be a parallel there about staying true to yourself, that it could mirror whatever it was that the old men and women were talking about. He took too long to think, though, and after a few moments' silence, Sam had taken the podium. He was steeled by the flask he had drunk and full at the cremation, and agitated at having to persevere through speeches that visibly annoyed him. He stood there in a stained white tweed shirt and faded black jeans, the mourners watching him with disinterest, and then the black sheep spoke. "I knew there was a reason I didn't have a funeral for the old man," Sam began. "Your pissant cause that you all talk so fondly about. What for?" The room sat patiently and politely, experienced with the case of the controversial funeral speech. "You saved some buildings in town. Wonderful. You won some lawyers and accountants and architects a nice view from their apartments. You still talk about it as though it happened last week, but none of you have the nuts to talk about why you gave up on people like Dad. You gave up on him when he was done for taking his bribes, for the kind of shit that you all probably considered, and now you remember him fondly. I don't remember my dad fondly. The only thing he ever gave me was a West jumper he found on a job site, and it didn't even fit. He used to tell me that being a Westie wasn't a source of shame, and it even meant something to us, that it gave us character. When I was a kid and Roy Masters and Tommy Rhodonicus took over at West, he told me that the Magpies stood for us, as fibros against the silvertails of the inner city. But what did you have doing them? What did you have him doing then? Doing free work for you lot, or all running around stopping development of the inner city foreshore because you didn't want it ruining some rich family's view of their yachts, calling yourself champions of the people. Where were you all when the works rolled through Liverpool or Campbelltown or even Lidcombe? Dad wasn't even that good of a bloke, but he was right about some things. He knew that being a labourer was honourable, and that being from out here was honourable too. He taught me that the moment you got a trade certificate, you had your eyes on becoming a builder, then you had your eyes on becoming a project manager, and then you were a developer, and before you knew it, you're a silvertail. So I stayed the course like he said I should, but look at you and look at me. You're all silvertails, using Dad as a nice little story about your past. Dad gave up when you all started talking about civility and shaking hands and signing off on wage freezes. So when he took bribes to make it worthwhile for him, whose fault was that? There was only one person who took the fall for you and my dad, and he went to jail while you all wiped your hands off it and let the BLF die so you could get along with things for yourselves. I learned to never give a shit about any of that. About this joke of a party that you all ran into the ground. Communists in this country. Sam leaned close to the microphone, unperturbed by the silence of the room. I learned to look after myself and trust nobody, because that was where Dad fucked up. He trusted you. Well, it doesn't matter now, does it, comrades? The man in the blue cardigan frowned and said something to his wife. One woman got up and left with a wave of her hand, and the crowd stood otherwise unmoved and guiltless, as though nothing had been said. Sensing the end of ceremonies, the old men and women shuffled out of the function room and into the carpeted hallway. Some strolled out into the Macquarie Mall, others sat down at the bistro for an early dinner, or some looked for an unattended poker machine to whittle away the afternoon. All the speeches rang familiar notes to Walt, but it was the comrade address that nagged at his memory. Walt remembered one afternoon when his granddad squeezed the word tersely through his teeth, while Walt sat on the floor watching the footy. He recalled the venom in the room and the weight it carried when Fred spat down a line, "Listen, comrade." He was confused at the funeral to find that it was often said with graceful and loving tones by everyone but his father. When Walt brought this up with his dad on the drunken drive home that was spent weaving through back streets to avoid any chance of a breath test, the indirect route gave Sam time to fill his son in on the missing details. He said that the time Walt heard comrade spat down the phone by his granddad was probably around the time that Fred was being hounded by the junior secretary of the CFMEU. He was an upstart with a union that discovered evidence of the bribes Fred accepted in the last days of the BLF. Sam claimed that Fred got away with his dabbling in corruption for almost 10 years until he was exposed in the early 90s. "I'm sure it was slipped cash for years," Sam explained bitterly. "But it's the carport out the back that they found on the books. Free materials and labour to make him call off a stop work." Walt tried to make sense of the unfamiliar terms he'd just been exposed to. "Like he made a trade?" "Yeah, sure," Sam pulled around a corner. "You could say that Granddad traded a carport for a block of flats on the Georges River."